Now that we've learned a little about biodiversity and how humans develop from biodiversity and ecosystem services, we're going to move into different conservation strategies for preserving different species. Those threatened species might be threatened, they might be endangered, and also how we can conserve ecosystems to maintain them in a healthy way. So we'll discuss some of the ways that ecologists, in essence, decide where they're going to place their focus. So biodiversity is very closely related to ecosystem function. We've already talked about how diverse environments lead to stable environments and how areas that have higher species richness or species diversity can essentially remain healthy in the face of disturbances. We talked about that earlier in our ecology unit. But what is a measure? How can we measure how diverse is good enough? Well, really, it depends on the environment. It depends on the organisms that we're talking about. But there are two basic models for determining how stable or how much stability is needed and how much biodiversity is needed to maintain that proper ecosystem function. So the two main models that answer the question how much biodiversity is needed for an ecosystem to function properly are the diversity stability hypothesis and the keystone hypothesis. So the diversity stability hypothesis says that species-rich communities are more stable than those with fewer. So we've already talked about this in terms of disturbances and succession, but overall health can be related to species-rich communities as well. And that is because the variety of different organisms are all playing key roles in that environment. And all of their roles depend on one another. So if you start to lose a number of species, even just one species, you can break down the stability of that environment and you can end up with a less healthy, less functioning ecosystem. The second hypothesis that attempts to answer the question of how much biodiversity do we need is called the keystone hypothesis. So the keystone hypothesis says that whatever the natural level of biodiversity is in an environment is the air quote correct level of biodiversity. And when we begin to lose biodiversity from those natural levels, ecosystem function begins to plummet. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, these are essentially the same thing because they're both talking about loss of species and loss of stability or loss of function. And that's kind of the key here, is that the more diverse your community or your ecosystem is, the more healthy overall it's going to be, regardless of which organisms it loses. And there are probably some organisms who have a stronger effect on health and stability than others. We'll talk about those later. But really, all of the natural members of that community are going to be important for proper ecosystem function. So how do we maintain that biodiversity? We've talked about all of the ways that humans are negatively impacting our planet, and it might sometimes seem a little bit hopeless, and it is a really big job to maintain biodiversity, to conserve biodiversity, when we're also trying to balance that with feeding and taking care of over 8 billion people on our planet. And so ecologists really have a tough job of identifying ecosystems and organisms that really need conservation and also being considerate of the populations that are in a particular area. So for example, if you have a group of people who are removing trees from an area, they're probably not doing this because they don't like the trees. They're probably doing this because they're trying to make a livelihood. They're trying to find places to live. They're trying to have places for their cattle to graze or their crops to grow. And so all of these conservation strategies have to also take into account that there are people being affected by both the organisms that are being lost, but also the conservation strategies and the potential pushback to what those people are doing. That also doesn't mean that people are always doing what is best for the environment. Sometimes people are doing what is best for their company. Sometimes they're doing it to make money, regardless of what the negative impacts are. And so that's really where a lot of education has to take place between the ecological scientists and the people living in these environments that are most affected by human issues. So the goal of a conservation project is to essentially manage resources in a way that protects species, habitats, and ecosystems. So again, this is a balance, and it is not easy. It takes time, it takes money, it takes education. So there are several different conservation strategies. We're going to go through each of the 7 strategies listed here and just talk a little bit about what they are. There's not necessarily one that's better than the other. It depends on the situation. It depends on the animals. And so this isn't necessarily a hierarchy of things we need to do in a particular order. It's simply just different strategies for maintaining a healthy, balanced ecosystem. So one of the strategies is to focus on megadiversity countries. So megadiversity countries are countries that have the greatest number of species. They tend to be located in tropical and subtropical areas. So remember, this is related to primary production. When we have more energy, we can support more species and therefore more diversity. So it kind of makes sense that these megadiversity countries are located in tropical regions. So for example, Brazil, Indonesia, and Colombia are 3 of the countries with the highest number of species. And globally, just 17 countries contain roughly 70% of all species on Earth. So most of the species live in a very small area, very small region, encompassed by these megadiversity countries. The reason that these places are so important is that they all often have endemic organisms. So endemic organisms are organisms that are only found in one particular place. They're found nowhere else on Earth. And that place might be small, it might be big, but they are only found in a particular region. What that means is they're probably specifically adapted to that region, and they can't survive anywhere else. Very often, these populations are also isolated from other areas, other more closely related groups. And so they can't necessarily move and interbreed with other groups. So these species are usually really important because they are key in their areas and found nowhere else. Biodiversity hotspots are similar to megadiversity countries. They're often found in sort of similar biomes, similar regions. Biodiversity hotspots are places where there are just a huge concentration of species. And the problem with biodiversity hotspots is that many of them are also under the threat of destruction, usually from human encroachment, clearing land, things like that. So there are 34 hotspots. You can see them in different colors around the globe here. Again, most of these are in our tropical regions, but these are going to be really unique environments that have a huge number of species. To qualify as a diversity hotspot, the region must have at least 1,500 species of endemic vascular plants. Vascular plants are basically the plants that you're used to. And then they must have those species, those 150 species, must have lost at least 70% of their original habitat. So there are places where we have a lot of species and they are very threatened, usually by encroachment of people. Tropical rainforests have lots of endemic species. And this is a good thing because tropical rainforests attract attention. People are aware of tropical rainforests. They like to visit them. They learn about them in schools. And so just by sort of receiving more attention than other places, there's a lot of conservation efforts being focused on the tropics. But some of that's also related to the importance of those regions. Another conservation strategy is to look for representative habitats. These are areas that are threatened areas, and they are areas that are unique in the type of organisms that they have. Usually these representative habitats are small habitats. They may not be as diverse as some other places. They may not be as diverse as tropical rainforests, for example. And they also may not be quite as threatened, but their importance is in their uniqueness. So for example, the Pampas area of South America, this is kind of a high altitude grassland plain. It's not very big, but it is unique worldwide and has some unique organisms there that are found nowhere else. So for this one, it's not necessarily that the threat is imminent, that these organisms are all going to become extinct in the immediate future, but more that we are preserving them because of their uniqueness. The last of the wild strategy is an approach that involves preserving areas that humans haven't got to yet. So there are not a lot of these regions left on Earth. Most places have been affected by humans. So Last of the Wild really covers about 10% of the world. Most other areas have been affected by humans in some way. So these tend to be isolated environments or extreme environments where people don't want to go. So for example, really cold tundras, boreal forests, really far north areas, northern Canada, northern Russia, even the Antarctic. These are places where people just really haven't established a presence. Deserts are pretty extreme. They're hard to live in places. It's hard to live in places with no water or limited water. And then some tropical rainforests are just so dense that people really haven't penetrated into those forests. So Last of the Wild is kind of similar to representative habitats. It's really preserving a place that is sort of unique and untouched.